Yes, that is. Can I just put it somewhere? Maybe you'd like to put it in a t-shirt? Can they hear me? They can't hear me yet, right? Not now, but if you put it in your... Can they hear me? If they can hear me now. No, right? Yeah, I think, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Be careful what you say now. Can you turn it off? Or turn it off? Yeah.
see all the time. You could just start. The first thing you say is like, raise your hand, something like that. Most of the people are okay with it.
Hello everyone, good evening. Before we start, I just want to inform you that you're going to be photographer taking pictures this evening and we'll post it on social media. So if anyone is opposed to receiving their
Okay, I guess everyone can hear me. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachma, president of ACHN. I would like to thank each one of you for being here with us today. We are very pleased to be able to welcome those of you that have been supporting us from day one, but also who are new here at an ACHN event. Before we get started, we would like to express our sincere appreciation to Eline and Elias from the EDI office, who generously helped us make this event come together, and our previous event on the 15th, also for Diversity Month. So tonight we will be focusing on the legacy of the Dutch slave trade, decolonizing the everyday. With this topic, we hope to identify and talk about the traces of the slave trade left in the Dutch society today and how we can overcome them, especially traces left in our everyday actions and that we might not even think about, hence decolonization. So the room that we are currently in today is named after Belle van Zuylen. She's very much honored by the university, but not many people know she had very close connections with slavery. And through her family, she mainly gained her assets through slavery. And tonight we will discuss the role Belle van Zuylen had exactly in the Dutch slave trade, which later on will be mentioned by Nancy Jouwe. So we have three very inspiring speakers tonight. So first we have Rachel Gullet. She is an assistant professor in cultural history at Utrecht University, teaching modern Europe and empire. Her research focuses on the race in France, on popular culture, and on the Black Atlantic from a French perspective. Prior to joining Utrecht University, she served as an assistant director for undergrad studies in the history and literature concentration at Harvard University. And currently she is the co-founder and co-organizer of the decolonization group at Utrecht University. And she is involved in decolonial initiatives within and beyond Utrecht University. Our second speaker is Nancy Jouwe. She's a cultural historian, lecturer, researcher, public speaker, and one of the authors of the newly published book Slavernij en de Stad Utrecht. Nancy is involved in several projects, but she's also involved in a very interesting project called Mapping Slavery NL that brings together traces of the Dutch role in the history of slavery. Previously, Nancy worked as a junior researcher at Utrecht University, and her research focuses on the post-colonial cultural and social movements and the history of slavery of the Netherlands. And currently, she's a fellow at the University of the Arts, Utrecht. Our third speaker is Matthijs Kuipers. He is a historian and currently working as a researcher at Nationaal Comité 4 en 5 mei. Previously, Matthijs worked at Utrecht University as a lecturer and as a researcher at the European University Institute in Florence. And alongside Nancy, Matthijs is also one of the authors of the newly published book, Slavernij in de Stad Utrecht. So each speaker tonight will give a presentation about their research. Nancy and Matthijs will focus on their recently published book, and Rachel will give a presentation about her work in the decolonization group at Utrecht University and on her views on decolonization within the university. So first, we would like to welcome Nancy Jouwe to hold her presentation.
I guess that's me. And you want me to talk through the mic, right? So, good evening, everyone. Here live at the Belle van Zuilen room, but also at home. I don't know, the camera is over there, so I'm waving at you. It's an honor for me to be here, and a joyous occasion to share our collective work with you. And it's really, really nice also to see a room with a lot of diversity. Because Utrecht University, in my time, was a very, very white space. So it's really, really, really nice to see you all. Okay, so I've been given 10 minutes, and so I want to use them well. I was the coordinating editor for a commissioned research, which already has been mentioned, Slavernij in de Stad Utrecht, which we published in June 2021, and because of the publishing of the book, the mayor of Utrecht actually formally apologized for the role that Utrecht played February 23. So it's quite an occasion, and it's the third mayor who is now who has apologized, and that's all because we had a really great group of very committed researchers, including several students from Utrecht University who worked on the book. Next slide, please. This is the editorial team. This is our PR picture. I always like to show it. Next slide. Indeed, I've been working on, so I've been co-written a book with Gloria Wekker on Black feminism in the Netherlands and on colonial history. And these are some of the books that I co-edited, specifically focusing on slavery. Can you go back, please? Yeah. And I brought them with me, actually, so if you're interested in them, they're all, I think, in English or bilingual. And some of them, indeed, were done in a project called Mapping Slavery. There's a website there that also, where we really, mapped the history of slavery to bring it also to Dutch soil, because until the year 2000, slavery was basically seen as something that had nothing to do with the Dutch or Dutch history. It was seen as an American history. Next slide, please. So when we were asked, when I was, when this public servant came up to me and said, well, Nancy, can you work on this history? Because we're really keen on getting a book on that. One of the sources of inspiration has been this walking guide, which has its 10th anniversary this year, actually. And 11 years ago, we already launched a walking tour through the city of Utrecht. So November 2011, that also touches on traces of slavery in the city. Next slide, please. So how did the process of our research look like? So there was a motion by local politicians that were passed in Utrecht municipality, and I think it's important to note that the role of local politicians, where national politicians are sort of shying away completely from this topic. So it's been in cities like Rotterdam, The Hague, Amsterdam, and also Utrecht, from also particular political parties and others that are very sort of resistant to it, but they've been pushing actually for this to be put on the agenda. So it's, for us as researchers, it's really important to have a diversity of stakeholders also. So basically, we started to do some preliminary research. This is the archives that we went into: Utrecht Archive, National Archive, City Archive of Amsterdam, but also online, Delver, for instance. Funny though, COVID happened, and then we couldn't enter the archive anymore. Another funny thing happened. Utrecht, the archive of Utrecht was actually hacked. So the last sort of bit of our research, we couldn't actually get into the archive anymore. So we had to kind of make do. But there you go. So a bumpy road, and speedy road, because we did all of this less than a year. But nonetheless, we had a wonderful book presentation. Next slide, please. What we did in the book, so we had, in the end, my initial thought was to have like 7, maybe 8 chapters. It doubled fairly quickly into 20 chapters and 18 authors. Also, a lot of people that didn't cooperate that I really would have liked to have, seen in the book. But there you have it. And these are the 5 sort of different themes that we addressed. One of them also being Black presence in Utrecht, and it's a nice link with this particular group tonight, because one of the articles actually speaks on a Black student network that was active in the mid-90s, and I was part of that network. So the story continues, and that's really heartwarming. Okay, next slide, please. So what has been our main conclusion in our research? So the city of Utrecht was formally involved in slavery. Municipalities, citizens, and institutions of Utrecht have directly and indirectly instigated, invested in, and profited from colonial exploitation and production systems based on slavery in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Utrecht shows that a city without large colonial institutions can still be closely linked to the Dutch history of slavery. The deep-rooted colonial interests of Utrecht and the long history of Black presence and abolitionism show the intertwinement of the city with the slavery past and its afterlife. So, and when we began, this is not a conclusion that we, fathomed, really. So we were quite surprised ourselves, although we knew, much could be found. And next slide, please. If you walk through the city of Utrecht, the city starts to work or speak to you as an archive. At least this is a methodology we kind of developed also along the way. Hi, come in. We're already started. But great to see you. We can see sculptures, we can see gable stones, Next slide. We can see buildings and homes and shops where this history is materialized. For instance, does anyone know where this is? Any Utrecht University folks? Yeah, it's Janskerkhof number 12, right? So it's really, and you see, what are you looking at? 3 Moorheads, for instance, right? So it's coat of arms of a family. So, next slide. And one of the stories, and this is also one of my favorite stories to tell when I give a city tour, walking tour, is the story of Eduard of Akaboa, who was a free black man, probably from Angola, maybe from Ghana. We're not really sure, who pops up in the archives already in 1652. He lives in the Drie Haringstraat, which is off Oude Gracht, right? This is the Oude Gracht. Here's the Hema, right? So he lived there with his wife, who was from Utrecht, and he was a weapons engraver. And because he was from the region of Angola, around what is now called Angola, people were known for being really good with handling metal, for instance. And you can see his son, their grandson, and their great-grandson all became, versed in metal. And their descendants lived in Utrecht until the 18th century. So for us, it's also important to actually talk about Black presence and also to show that, this wasn't a white space necessarily. And just very nearby in what is now called the museum Speelklok tot Pyramid, which used to be the Bruurkerk, which is a 5-minute walk from where Eduard van Akaboa lived. There's also 2 black women who are buried in that particular church. Okay, next slide. And she was already mentioned. Belle van Zuylen was actually I'm running a little bit out of time, but I hope you're bearing with me. Belle van Zuylen is, of course, the pride of Utrecht, but we have a whole chapter on her life specifically. She's known for being a very independent woman who talked about women's rights, and bell hooks came from Belle van Zuylen on a Belle van Zuylen leerstoel appointment in 1992 for 3 months, for instance. So, we're very proud, definitely also in Utrecht. But if you look at her family's history, both on their mother's side and her father's side, her family was deeply involved in the colonial structure, being, having important roles both in the East India Company and West India Company. And what we discovered also that her own vermogen, help me even, Nederlanders. Wealth, right, thank you. 40% of her wealth came from colonial endeavors. So that's quite a high number. And this provided her with a life where she could basically do what she wanted, be a writer, be traveling, and having, access to this enormous network. Just to finish off, just a couple of slides. We've also mapped where we can find this history back. You can find it on our website sporenvanslavernijutrecht.nl, where we can see the role of the church, where few sea people where the elite lived, Black presence, colonial heritage, it's all there. And you can see this is at least like 50, points where you can find this history. And I'm sure we could find more if we, kept working on it. Janskerkhof is a particular hub where many of the colonial elite lived, and almost every house has a history with colonialism. and slavery. For instance, in this house, Jan van Voorst lived, who was the Governor General of Fort Elmina. And do we know what Fort Elmina is? It's the slavery fortress in Ghana where millions of people were transported into the Middle Passage and onto the Americas. And you can see, for instance, the seashells in the building. That sort of is also a reference too, right? Next slide. We give walking tours. This is one of our guides, Frank. I think he's watching, so hi, Frank. At home, that is. And what's really, really cool, just to end it, was that Sites of Memory, which is a theater group, made, on the basis of our research, a really beautiful theater production last year. Future for the Past was the name of it, which was a sort of theatrical walking tour from the city theater, Stad Schouwburg, where there used to be a sugar refinery, to the city hall, where people also, many people in the city government were also investors in colonialism and slavery. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Is this audible, everybody? Fabulous. And I'm setting my timer following Nancy's fantastic example. And also really building on what Nancy says, because Nancy and Matthias are the experts here, so I'm going to sort of zoom out and do a little bit more from a more general historical and maybe theoretical viewpoint. But one thing I would like to open with is you asked me to speak about decolonizing the everyday. And as Nancy pointed out, we are here in the Bell van Saule room. Well, at many Utrecht occasions, at various laudatio, at the graduation ceremonies of many, many people, one of the things that's standard that I've encountered in Dutch culture is to say a little bit about a room like this. We are here in this place, we are celebrating these people. And then in the history department, at least, we often give a little explanation of the room that we're standing in. And I wonder how many laudatio to this point have mentioned in the Bell van Saule room, or whatever the equivalent is where this is taking place, in the way that Nancy just did, the complex legacies of the people in whose names the room honor. And that is just an example of decolonizing the everyday. When you have this ceremony, you present the whole person with all their complexities and the other people that they have affected in the way that Nancy just did. So I kind of wanted to open with that anecdote and grounding and also move into some of the things I have to say. So yes, indeed, I want to make today this is what I'll try and do in the next 10 minutes, which is a lot, as it's characteristic for me. I'll talk very briefly about the link between slavery and decolonization, introduce the Decol group, and we do try and work on decolonizing the everyday here at the university, and also some of the bigger structures, and then give a couple of concrete examples. And as a very quick summary, I know many of you know this story very well, but why am I here as a member of the Decol group speaking about enslavement and slavery in Utrecht? Well, the binding tie that bound so many is colonization. And colonization, of course, was in part predicated on the racialization and enslavement of black bodies by white people in many cases of European colonization, and the wealth that undergirded colonization and that lay underneath many of these universities, actually, and have provided for our excellence in knowledge. That wealth was in many cases provided by the products of colonization and by what some people have called the racial capitalism of colonization, the extraction of resources from the soil through the unpaid labor of racialized bodies that then fed back into the home country, in this case the Netherlands. I work more on France, and was in many ways funneled into universities and the education of elite racialized white people and not offered to some of the people and their descendants who had provided the racialized labor that is part and parcel of colonization. So therefore, and you can see that in trade, you can see that in enslavement, you can see that in plantation economies, and it binds these places that have not always acknowledged their links with enslavement, because slavery didn't happen right here, right? It does bind these places together with their colonies, and that is the linkage that we pursue in decoloniality and decolonization. And very often people, and Tuck and Yang are scholars that are famous for this, will say, well, how can you decolonize? Like, you've co-opted the term decolonization, because decolonization has to do with getting back the soil that was colonized. But scholars of decoloniality and decolonization will also say, we need to pursue those links between the colonies and the metropole, and where the products of the colonized, racialized labor went, and what work it has done in society, and how that has contributed to current conditions of inequality within the walls of our university, as well as elsewhere. So those are some of the links that I make between slavery, enslavement, the memory of slavery, and colonization. And the point that I made about decolonization being a difficult term when it comes to the metropole, the colonizer, is a particularly potent one in France and the Netherlands, because there is always this claim that we didn't colonize here. This is not colonized ground right here. And indeed, I've put it here, empire, but no large-scale enslavement on our own soil, which means there's plausible deniability. Which means, as in Gloria Wecker's words, you can pretend that you are innocent of the great harms that have been committed. And I think this is an important part of the silencing that Nancy works to undo, and in fact, that her projects work to undo. And without consulting Nancy, I had in fact located and identified this photo of the performance in Utrecht from my own personal archives, which was one of the things that enlightened me to the traces of the black presence in Utrecht. And, you know, I'm a scholar of racialization and empire and blackness. And yet this was also an opening of my eyes when I walked through the streets of Utrecht and with my children, and I'm allowed to put their pictures up because I've asked them, but saw Jennifer Tosh, I think it is, there alerting us to the black presence in the Netherlands. And that undoes some of the work of white innocence. Now, in this case, this was a descendant of a freed person, but in so many cases, as with the pictures on the gables, literally labor-made property that Nancy showed us, the silencing was of enslaved bodies, enslaved people, enslaved individuals. And so I'll just go to the next slide. So how can we contend with this as a group based at Utrecht University? We've talked a bit about this at the decolonization group. And it came to a head with the Black Lives Matter movement, or we were galvanized a little bit, and we were moved to formulate some of the things we try and do in a statement of support and solidarity, which is one thing we can do in the university. We can unsilence, we can call out, we can state, we can make visible, and we can express solidarity, even when, honestly, sometimes in the university setting, it's not that polite or not that popular. Your colleagues don't find it terribly convenient sometimes when you insist on asking, for example, if the department is going to issue a statement of solidarity. Whether they should or should not, that's another issue, but it's sometimes seen as awkward to ask these things. And so as the Decol group, this is one of the statements we made, and I think it helped us articulate some of the ways we do things. We are scholars, so we do have workshops, we do have events, we have lectures open to the public, and we interrogate what is decolonization, what is decoloniality, and we study that a little bit. We also think representation is important, so we try and include, feature, and amplify the voices of those who have traditionally been marginalized from the academy. And if you look at our seminar series, particularly from last year, that is very visible in the people we select and invite to speak with us. And we engage in dialogue and critical self-reflexivity. And I think this is a really important point, this self-reflexivity and critical dialogue. And I have about 1:20, so I'll whip through the rest of my presentation. We have members, some of our members have called out the representation in the hiring of the university, or the lack of representation of scholars of color in this university, and asked why that is and what we might look at systemically and what we can do at the departmental level, but also brought attention to this. And I'll just point you to Ozan's work. Thank you. Another example is in our teaching. We can think about what we teach and how we teach it. When I teach the French Revolution, I always teach the Haitian Revolution because they are inextricably intertwined. And the Haitian Revolution shows black people fighting for their own freedom. They are not given their freedom, and I say they because this is not my past, but I teach it. And so the Haitian Revolution should be included as natural, obvious, and necessary when you teach the French Revolution. It shaped the course of events. But not to teach that is the sort of silencing that we have engaged in often in the European Academy. Sorry, can you go back a second? I talked about this when I said they fought for their own freedom. Sometimes we say, oh, you know, the French granted freedom to the slaves. That's me. So I'll just take 1 minute more. I think it's really important to say slaves fought, enslaved men and women who were people, who are people, fought for their own freedom. They were not granted it. They were not given it on a silver platter. Enslaved men and women knew very clearly what freedom was. They had their vision of it, and they fought for it. And I think this is an important act of teaching self-reflexivity that is, A, more accurate than some versions that are taught, and B, more inclusive and does sort of decolonizing work. Listen to scholars of Haiti and Haitians. And a lot of this is summarized in a fantastic book by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot that on the theoretical level kind of lays out some of the guidelines that Nancy and Matthijs and I try and follow in our work. And his book is called Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. And as a historian, and now we can change the slide, this was just one example. When you teach sources like this is a white source. It's a source produced by white pro-colonization settlers, and it shows the uprising of enslaved people, but it very much features the violence. And so I think it's great to show it because it shows action and agency, and then also to contextualize it. Who produced this? Whose point of view is it showing? That's basic history, but it also has a decolonization and kind of slavery aspect too. Okay, so to get back to and sort of end with Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, this is the kind of decolonial self-reflexivity that I think we can use throughout the academy and think about how we know what we know, an epistemological critique. So silence, when do we silence things? What records are preserved? And this is the brilliance of this work here, the gables, the buildings, the going into the archives. How do we recover what has been preserved and identify what has not? Identify the silences. How do we show how archives are made and what they leave out? How do we make narratives? And how do those who make narratives then get sanctified by scholars so that their knowledge becomes prescribed in curriculum and taught to generations and generations? And these are some of the points that Trouillot makes about how knowledge is produced and what filters into the university and what is lost in that process. So finally, yes, you guys know this. You've already been writing about this and doing this work, and it just remains for me to express solidarity with that, and thank you all, and pass the mic to Matthijs. So thank you for your work.
All right. Thanks, Rachel. Same question. Am I audible before I continue talking? Great. Well, it's an easy night for me, with Nancy already introducing the book Slavernij in de Stad Utrecht. So that means I can dive into the specifics almost directly. One thing I will do before is introduce myself. My name is Matthijs Kuipers. Yeah, first slide, please. So here you see some of the things I did in the past. Right one. Obviously, I will get to that in a second. The middle book came out just a month ago, but it's actually written well before Slavernij in de Stad Utrecht. It's my PhD, and publishing that kind of stuff sometimes takes time. But it's also, there's quite some connections. So, for instance, one of the things that was already mentioned actually by both of you, that is the black presence in the Netherlands, or in Utrecht even, and the presence of people of color that has stretched out for centuries. And that's often been not visual, unacknowledged. That's something I saw in my research too, and in fact, it's on the cover. This is a photo taken in the Netherlands. It's a few Dutchmen and it's two Indonesians, Cipto Mangunkusumo and Suwardi Suryaningrat. They were early Indonesian nationalists, writers, educators, and they're here. They were here because of their political activity in Indonesia. They were exiled, and they spent a couple of years in the Netherlands. The thing on the left, that's not a book cover yet, and it might not even become one, but it's, you can see it over here, Het Witte Dorp in Voorthuizen, so the White Village. That was an education camp of sorts in the late 50s, where the Dutch government housed Indonesian families, or Indo-Dutch families rather, who they deemed not adapted to Dutch society enough. They were not civilized enough. They were, and the language they used was things like they were too much oriented on the East, or equivalents. It's in the early stage. I'm actually looking for people who live there, and that's hard to find because it was a rather small camp. It's about 60 families in total who live there. But hopefully I'll manage to speak to some of them. All right, next slide now, please. This is more of the book. Because I only have 10 minutes, I will not, it's like a whole variety of case studies, so I will not dive into all of them because then my 10 minutes will be gone. So I will not say, or almost not say anything about the Boy Scouts, because that's like an hour. But let me say, it was invented with a very imperial purpose in mind, namely to train white youth in Europe. Like the original comes from Britain, so it was frail city youth in England that Baden-Powell had in mind, and he wanted to train them to be proper civil servants of empire, to run the empire, basically. And it was adapted to the Dutch setting as well. So this is actually a translation of the original. And that shows how, like, it's sort of imperial ideology in action. And of course, that builds on all the images and ideas that had been formed in the centuries before this moment. in those centuries that we also describe in Slavernij in de stad Utrecht. It contained very racist ideas, and they came from that imperial setting where slavery was normalized. So on the surface, you might think, okay, what does this have to do with Slavernij in de stad Utrecht? Well, it is connected. And on the right, that's a tea room that's also served as the first Indonesian restaurant of sorts in the Netherlands. It's from around 1900, and they served rice table, which is a very, it contains Indonesian dishes, it contains Dutch dishes, and the whole sort of social setting in which it was served and eaten sort of confirmed all the hierarchies of empire. And it was used in the Netherlands as a means of propaganda. So eating the rice table was meant to get white Dutch people enthusiastic for empire and interested in it. They were not always. And that's another thing where we see how empire works. I think you also both mentioned this already, namely that slavery, imperialism was something that happened over there in the imperial self-image and not in the metropole in the Netherlands. And so that's interesting that they even had to use propaganda to get people here sort of see those connections, because in the centuries before it worked, this sort of disseminating this idea that the metropole had nothing to do with the colonies. All right, so that's what I want to say about my PhD research. There's more case studies in it. Next slide, please. Because then there's also some things about Slavernij in de stad Utrecht that I want to share. And here I can skip the whole introduction and dive into the specifics indeed. One of the questions that you sent me beforehand was how did Utrechters profit from this when there was no direct formal connection, in the sense that you mentioned the absence of a East India Company chamber. Which is true, there was no such chamber in Utrecht. I thought maybe it's good to highlight that one of our main conclusions, we had 9, so Nancy just gave the sort of merger, the summary, so the merger of all 9 conclusions in a couple of sentences. This is the first out of 9, and that is that even though there was no such chamber in Utrecht, there was a formal institutional connection. So, and in fact, there are several ways in which you can approach this. One is that there was representation of Utrecht in other chambers. So there were representatives from the city in the provincial administration, and the provincial administration was part of the entire country, and the entire country was part of the East India Company chamber. So in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam, there were representatives from that system, and they came from Utrecht too. But there's also more sort of direct things that happened here, and this is also one of the examples that shows how difficult it is sometimes to actually separate formal institutional involvement and private involvement. Because that was one of our other conclusions, that there was a lot of involvement from individuals that were in the city administration. So basically the whole city elite was involved in slavery. And the Utrecht Company is an example. It's a company founded in 1720. It was not a major success. That's why you might not have heard of it before. It never became as big as the East India Company. And indeed, it was a private investment fund with all those city administrators part of it. They were the ones who founded it, who had the shares. But it was also made possible by the city administration. There were rules. You had to have a permission to start such a thing, and the city granted it. So that's a form of institutional involvement too. And in fact, of all the things that investment funds did, one of the things was done explicitly because the city requested So, and that request was to build a canal. So this is a way in which Nancy's presentation and mine are very complementary. Nancy just highlighted all sorts of physical remains of this connection. I'm going to show you some of the things that never materialized because this canal never came to be. But for those who are looking at the picture already, this is of course the city of Utrecht, and this is supposed to be a straight line to like coming near Amersfoort and then here entering the Zuiderzee. And perhaps if you go to the next slide, we have another picture of it. It's a very straight line, and actually it was never a real technical plan. This was more sort of promotion to get people buy shares. At least that's what we suspect, because after the Utrecht company started, there's more traces of the Utrecht company. They did a lot of things, but this canal, it's at least, if we trust the archival sources, it's nothing more than actually the pictures I'm showing you here. If you go to the next slide, yeah. Other things that the Utrecht company did, and again, we're still talking about private involvement of individuals, but remember, it started with formal involvement of the city of Utrecht. Other things that the company did was, for instance, buy a plantation in Suriname. This is one of the famous maps of Suriname from that time, and over here, and if you go to the next slide, I've highlighted where it is. There it is, the plantation that people from Utrecht bought and ran. It's called Utrecht, so again, a very obvious connection from the city to that plantation. And one other thing they did, if you go to the next slide, and it was also mentioned already, is buy or actually run a sugar refinery in Utrecht. It's not here anymore, so this is the Lucas Bolwerk, and if you go to the next slide once more, and this is how it looked like. So again, a very tangible trace of empire, of slavery, right in the heart of the city. Well, actually, not right now. It's in the heart of the city. Back then, it was at the border of the city. And as you know, it's not there anymore. But it's not a coincidence that the theater tour started right there, because right now it's the spot where the Stad Schouwburg is located. Let's see. Yeah. Coming back to that question that you posed to me, and I'm going to check how much time I've left. I'm over my 10 minutes already, or am I not? Yeah, okay. I'll keep it short. One question was, okay, so how did ordinary or semi-ordinary Utrechters profit from the slave trade and from imperial businesses? And this is how it looked in practice, because there was a thing we could... well, there was. It's something I called in my chapter some form of cognitive distance. Again, sort of suggesting that empire was not something that happened here, and that you didn't have to have any detailed knowledge of it. And this showed in the way how these finances worked. People with money who profited from slavery, they didn't have to be financial experts. They didn't have to be experts on how plantations or on how slavery worked. They only had to read the newspaper, see an advertisement saying, buy shares in my investment fund, come to the office that was mentioned in that newspaper, and buy one of these vouchers and collect their interest later. So this is how it worked in practice. You could do it without, you could sort of conveniently ignore any specifics and anything about the situation in Suriname or other colonies, and profit from slavery. And this is what I wanted to end with, because this is the very opposite. If you ask about, if the question is, okay, how should we address this, or how can we set this straight even now? One thing is showing how it looked like, and that this connection was there. In fact, that's what Utrecht and slavernij is all about. And it's a good reminder that this was a tactic that we can actually borrow from abolitionists. This is one of the most famous images that we have that illustrates how slavery worked. This is one of the ships in the Middle Passage, so how enslaved people were transported from Africa to the West. And it's good to realize that we have this image because it's actually a means of propaganda from abolitionist sources. So showing how these connections work was part of trying to dismantle them. And I think that was true back then, and it's still true to some extent right now. So that's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you all for your amazing speeches and presentations. We're just going to transition into the discussion panel right now, so we'll just take a few minutes to set up. So take a breather, and if you have any questions, you can raise your hands when we get to that. And we also have our own questions, so we'll see you in a couple of minutes. Yeah.
we were in the process of writing the book, and then there was the book launch. And yeah.
You good to go? Yes. Use the microphone.
Hello. Yeah.
Okay.
Test. Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. The mics are working. Amazing. I hope everyone back at home is also back from their break as well. But again, I'd like to thank you guys for coming. And thank you for the speakers for your presentations. I learned a lot. And a lot of what I already knew wasn't really enforced. So I really found this session insightful. So before we begin the panel session, actually, I would like to open the mic to the audience. If anyone has any questions that you'd like to ask the speakers or just in general, please feel free to raise your hands now or anytime during the panel discussion, and we'll get to you. For now, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay, no problem, but then we'll start. So actually, we had a question directed towards Rachel. Can you mention, 1 second, technical difficulties. Yes, can you define what you mean by anti-racism?
That is a great and big question. And actually,
let's start light.
Yeah. And actually,
start with a definition so everyone else is on the same page.
Well, actually, before I say that, I also want to clarify something I said in my presentation, which is I think I unintentionally set up a contrast between Michel Rolf-Trouillot as a theorist and Nancy as a worker out of his theories. That is absolutely not what I meant to do. I was rushing at the end. And Nancy is, of course, a theorist and intellectual and does amazing work. And I just wanted to clarify that I didn't mean to set up that opposition. And that, I think, is also an important part of anti-racism, is being aware of your mistakes and your positionality and the things that you unintentionally do. But anti-racism, this caught me a little bit by surprise, but I do think that anti-racism is acting against any form of oppression of people who have been racialized by structures and systems in the everyday. And it also is linked to a humanism and to a belief in universal and equal rights that nevertheless recognizes that some people have been racialized and haven't had them. And we need to work extremely hard to counteract the effects that that has had in everyday life. That's enough for now.
Thank you. Okay, I actually want to open a question to everyone. So historically, the duty to have these conversations about slavery and the slave trade has been put on people of color. So how do we get people of color, non-people of color, so white people to engage with these conversations critically?
Is that a question for white people?
For the intellectuals.
Shall I? Perhaps I can repeat something that Rachel already said in her presentation, because indeed we as white people should do more work when it comes to this. And one thing she mentioned is being this annoying colleague, sort of posing the question, mentioning the issue, also at moments when people are annoyed by it. And I remember this from my time at Utrecht University too, that indeed there are a lot of colleagues who think they work on issues that have nothing to do with imperialism, slavery, its legacies, and thus not with racism or anything today. I believe, and I think many people at this table believe, that it's connected to almost the entire world as it is today. So it has to do with virtually every subject that you dive into. Thus, all those colleagues can connect their work in some way to issues about racism, and every work can contain some aspect of anti-racism. So I think we should sort of work to have people see this, or sort of try to engage with it. It's very new to some people, but and I think we can, you're being the annoying colleague when you do so. So I think yes, Rachel and me, we can be that colleague.
Yeah, I was just at a talk on at a conference, and the keynote dealt with partly with this issue, how white people can be allies, and that it was led by 4 black women, and one of them ended with, "You guys," and she was a racialized black speaking specifically to her white colleagues, and she said, "You guys have access to rooms that we are not always in." And one might think of executive boards or such things, or indeed departmental conversations. So one answer is sometimes actually saying the same thing behind closed doors that you might in public, or the same thing when it's inconvenient or is hard or is awkward. And I think that is, when you become aware that this is a difficult but necessary thing to do as a white scholar working on racism. But your question was actually, how do we get other people to become part of the conversation? And that is a difficult one, because there's some good work on, if you call someone a racist, they'll just hate you. And or it can end in a very unproductive conversation. And yet this is an important thing to illustrate. Like, it's really important to illustrate how racism works and how pervasive it is, and to do that critical work. I think one of the things I learned when I was studying the suffrage movement, for women's suffrage in America, was they had this pincer action, right? And some of the women would be very middle class and very conciliatory. They would raise money, and they would visit the president, and they would have tea with him, and they would be very nice, and they would show the rationality and the warmth of their kind of appeal, and then others would confront and protest and march in the streets. And I think you can see the same kind of action. And for many of our colleagues, I think they need an invitation as well as a confrontation, and just navigating when is which and which is when can be hard. But the more work gets done on every front, and it's work of this type, where the mayor is apologizing, where you have the evidence is on the table, quite literally in this case, and then people begin to take it seriously. So all sorts of fronts. And for me, speaking up and being awkward sometimes, and trying to invite and illustrate, and always be backed up with evidence. The burden of evidence on people doing anti-racist work is so much higher sometimes. Anyway, that's enough.
We have this whole set of coffee and
Yes, thank you for that.
Can I maybe add?
Of course, please.
Because I've worked with a lot of white people on this. I'm 54, almost 55, so I've been around. I've worked with people that I now don't want to work with anymore, because and I really sort of said goodbye to them also. I think there's it's really, really important for. I loved how you said that the awkwardness is there. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and I think it's really important to say, we need together, all colors involved, to be comfortable in getting uncomfortable together, because we've not have this very strong rooted collective conversation on race. I mean, white people to begin with in the Netherlands don't understand that they have an ethnicity. That's something relatively new. Any American student that comes in, and I have taught hundreds of American students right now, I don't have to explain to them what race is, but Dutch students, all Dutch white students, that is, are very uncomfortable when you start talking about that. So that's, secondly, being conscious of your whiteness and what that means. I think it's also very important to stop defending yourself, own up to your mistakes. I make mistakes too, by the way, and acknowledge that you can still learn. And I think for white Dutch people, in some ways, talking about race and positioning yourself in that conversation is going back to kindergarten or, primary school. although they're maybe very highly educated, right? And that's very uncomfortable for people because they have to acknowledge, oh, I'm really very ignorant here. But that's where the conversation actually starts to become more interesting. And I've also talked with myself about and like friends about this, and like how do I, there's a certain point where you also don't want to be the one constantly, teaching the other. You have to do your own work, and it's, otherwise it gets very, very tiring. It's not my responsibility necessarily. So I don't know. Those are some of the things that, and I still have a lot of white friends, so don't worry. This is not, it's not about that, but it's really about acknowledging whiteness. And I've had, black people. I've been, met black people who, think from whiteness as a dominant understanding. Literally, I was moderating an after talk after a movie. There was this black man who stood up and he said, "We as white people." And it was like, okay, I can go 2 rows, and which am I going to take now? But I wanted to, he was an elder man, and I didn't want, to be confrontational towards him. But it was, it was very uncomfortable, and then you have to do something in a split second. Some thoughts.
Yes, thank you for that. I remember, especially I think 2 years ago, we were having this conversation with a few unitmates of ours, and they asked their experience of when you're growing up as a young black child, you might not feel comfortable in your skin. And so this is an experience that's been iterated by many black people growing up for centuries, well, I'll say for hundreds of years, years, I will say, that they felt uncomfortable, but someone questioned, did you actually feel like that? So I feel like it's also a step of trusting and believing when someone says something, not needing it to be iterated hundreds of times. You just need to give that belief if it's not your experience as well. So I really resonated with what you just said. The second question I'd like to open to everyone is, how would you explain the importance of discussing the history of slavery to someone who doesn't think that it matters today?
Well, an interesting example was this book, because there was a political party in the city, in the municipality, that opposed, commissioning this book. But since then, they've changed their minds. And why? Because they thought it wasn't relevant to the city. And then, a little less than a year later, we've tried to show that it's very relevant. So they changed their mind. So I think the story is here that you need, knowledge production and just, unearth the facts, the historical facts that are there. But I've done a lot of talks now in about the history of slavery, and there's 2 things. People are extremely ignorant and think that it's nothing to do with the Dutch history or even the city's history. 1, and 2, they can't understand what it is. There's a complete, well, not complete, but there's a strong lack of empathy. So you have to sort of start explaining. You already referred to it, I think, in your talk, saying like I was, the National Archives had put some archival pieces on display, and they wanted me to comment on one of them. It was a document related to slavery. And then basically they wanted me to explain in 2 minutes on camera why people would, revolt on plantations. And that's such a basic thing. Like, why would you still want me to explain that? Isn't that kind of obvious? But apparently it is not. So this shows you, how far we are from a very knowledgeable sort of basic position to then have a conversation. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
Yeah, perhaps add a bit, because there's this balance between sort of some basic empathy that's needed, and sometimes indeed sharing or explaining things or sharing knowledge and building it helps. One thing sometimes I think there are sort of the counter arguments that you can actually take seriously and then turn around. One response that you often see is that it's been so long ago. And of course, you can think like, okay, we know that it's 150 years, and we have a book where there's many, like in any situation there is work. Like if you look around, you can know how sort of this thread from the abolition of slavery runs up to today, and that it's still relevant. But at the very same time, it's a question. Perhaps coming from a bad place, but it's not a bad question. It is a long, like 150 years, roughly, is a long time. It's more than a lifespan. So turn it around and look sort of what information do you need to see how that thread runs from back then up to today. There's one essay that we usually read in class by Ta-Nehisi Coates, for instance, on reparations, and he does that. He follows just like it's popular with white people, that essay. I'm told, and perhaps it is the case because it does show it to someone uninformed how slavery went into Jim Crow laws, how it went into particular housing policy. So it's not a wide essay; it's rather a sort of narrow, deep essay that takes this thread and follows it up to today, and then you can see it. So that's a way how sometimes that counter argument is a way sort of also an entry into getting where we want to be.
But maybe also to add to that, nobody says with Roman history, it's such a long time ago, and it's 2,000 years ago. So why are we saying it's such a long time ago? It's actually because, again, it makes us feel uncomfortable, and there's also guilt involved, right? People feel guilty, and they even don't want to acknowledge that they feel guilty, but they do. There's some, emotions also related to this, and I get that. But I've also, Bell Hooks taught us 30 years ago while she was here that, the importance here is not to, guilt. Feelings of guilt are very unproductive. I mean, they're normal. They come up, they pop up, but they're unproductive in the end. What's really productive is accountability, And that's also not necessarily that you personally are, responsible for all of this, but you take into account that this is part and parcel of our history, but also who we are together, and so that you have a role in it. So that to speak with Michael Rothberg, we're all implicated here. So what does that mean for us? Those are the questions.
Yeah, and just finally, also now. People no longer ask, why should we study women in history? That battle was fought, well, maybe some do, but it's not. And it's a clearly important subject. And so these battles are sort of fought and won, and it's just better history. It is the history of the nation. It is the history of the world. It is taking into account all perspectives. And so it's, in some ways, a similar argument you would make for any other area of historical study. This is good history. This is, as first-year history students, we are taught to find the best sources and the most sources, Well, source is obviously something that we've often thought of as textual, but actually, if you follow oral traditions and learn how to work with them, that is also a form of the best sources, the most sources that provide the best knowledge. And surely we are in the business of obtaining knowledge and the best knowledge possible from as many sources possible. And on the accountability thing, I think, I come from New Zealand and Aotearoa, and this is a country with it's a settler colonial country that has been shaped by that history. And so I think sometimes it's helpful for students when I position myself and say, I'm a Pākehā, I'm a white New Zealander, and my grandparents and great-grandparents directly benefited, in fact, from the expropriation of land from the Māori. And I didn't do that. And yet the education system through which I came and the social and cultural capital that I have accrued through my parents and their parents and the house that they own, the houses that they own, has something to do with how I live and move and have my being in the world today. So I have, in fact, benefited from these structural things. How then do we look at the structural level for those people who have not had that same benefit and take it as a collective responsibility to redress the inequities that have resulted? And sometimes, so I think accountability is the word, and not you have to give stuff back or you're bad, but like, where do we get to as a society from here? Now that this damage has occurred, how can we move through knowledge into a better future?
Thank you. Of course you can. Someone with a mic will.
You were talking about sources of knowledge, and my experience and my background in psychology, when we talk about impacts of colonization or racism, we talk about healing and in the psychological type of realms, but we're not actually talking about bodies as such. We see is that the enslavement of people involve bodies, and in psychology we learn a lot of these weird little cases of tiny little village in Norway that had a longitudinal study done because they've gone through a rough winter or something that could really change their genetics. That was done that improvement stuff. And only maybe 2 days ago I started reading about this researcher in India that's doing actual genetic work and sequencing people that come from regions that have been through a lot of famine from British imperialism. And that really truly changed the way their bodies work, and that they are now more prone to different types of ideas and also crap distribution that could harm you in the long run. And what I'm wondering is is there benefit of science when we talk about race? Are there implications that could turn into, poverty porn or white saviorism really quickly? And why is it that we don't really talk about science, not just on statistics, for better or worse? We live in a scientific society. The feelings of the marginalized matter, of course, but it's not the selling point to the general public. It's not a marketing ploy. But what are your views on the role of science and this field?
So I'm just going to repeat your question for the ones at home because they can't hear us. You're asking what are the views of science on the feelings of the marginalized people and their history. Is that correct?
More like, does it have a role at all to be explaining or to be progressing, to be constructive about it? As we discussed before, feelings of guilt are not really constructive. Not that science, the opposite of that. It is certainly I don't know, how would you think of it as a way forward?
I wish I could. No, I'm not doing a good job summarizing, but for the next questions, we'll have a mic that goes around. So for everyone at home, sorry you'll have to miss the peaceful, eloquent way our participants said this, but I opened the speakers.
So how I heard the question is the role of science in these matters, race issues and whatnot. This is a very simple summary of what you were saying. Your question was much richer than that, but I think you can look at it in a couple of ways. First of all, I would say that science itself is not innocent or neutral, right? So to acknowledge also that scientific racism that became really important in the 19th century and kind of has trickled down, is still in different parts of scientific research or the structure of science. Gender is a wonderful example of that. How science is structured in academia as an infrastructure is gendered and raised. But definitely, I would say the different scientific disciplines can and should play a role. But like you already mentioned, not everyone feels it's relevant to them, right? So I think that's where the work really starts. And I think every discipline, and I think the University of Utrecht actually just released a report last month. Also talking about the history of slavery and how the university itself, it's online, you can find it, is involved in this, and that every discipline should actually do something with it. But it's not like every discipline is ready for that. I mean, but definitely, if we look at, and definitely, you're talking about psychology. I know nothing about psychology, but what I do know is that intergenerational trauma is something that is immensely important, and that has also been very much pushed by the Jewish community, for instance, to explain how the Holocaust is passed through generations. Like, what's her name again from New York? Can't come up with her name right now, but yeah. So how, for instance, the second generation who's not been in the camps, for instance, sort of is traumatized by it nonetheless because of the family dynamic, for instance, right? Similarly, you can see how sort of the history of slavery has been passed on through families. And I think there's so little research still done, definitely, I think, in European in European academia, and definitely not in. I know there was a conference in Amsterdam in 2013 on this particular topic, but it's one of the very, very few that talks about that. And I think, it's really important for work to be done on that level. And I think the same goes for law. There's so much to say about the law and slavery. Again, huge lack. There's just nobody does any work on that. Luckily now, the VU in Amsterdam, the Vrije Universiteit, so the second largest university in Amsterdam, is going to start a project on it right now. With Jones involved in that, for instance. So there's tons of work still to be done on this. We're really at the start here. In many ways. I don't know if it answered your question, and I'm sure.
No, quite a bit actually. Because, at least now I'm not scientific myself. I see a lot of the issues and.
You're a psychology student, right?
Philosophy side. Yeah. But at the same time, it's also one of the more pragmatic ways to go about. For instance, if I want to know about my health risks, I want to know my genetics. I want to know how it was affected by 350 years of forced labor, because it did do something to this population that we studied. So more like this type of things. But then also at the same time, not to start associating negative things with people. Like we know how you get slippery really, really quickly, right? Like then you look at an entire continent as poor or as sickly, and that's definitely not what we want at all. But it is important.
Thanks.
Thank you for that question. Would anyone else like to raise a point? And then, Kimberly, please, Morgan will get you with a mic. Okay, you can also borrow my mic. Okay. Well, thank you. As was mentioned before, that
in the US, there's way more knowledge on like the history of enslavement and how this now translates to racism today. I was curious what your thoughts are and what we can maybe learn from like the American context in the Netherlands and maybe like in the larger European context.
Can I? Sure. So I have, as somebody coming from America into the Dutch Academy, I have often been critiqued for applying American standards to the Netherlands. And so I think this is a very difficult thing to navigate and to negotiate. And actually coming from my study of France, I'm still engaged in scholarly communities there on both sides of the Atlantic. And my French colleagues are being slammed at the moment and called overly American influence. They're Islamo-gauchiste because they apply this American analysis of race to the French situation. Of course, my colleagues said, yes, well, you know where the American theorists got their theories of race and racialization? Fanon, Césaire, Glisson. And so I think it's really useful and interesting to acknowledge that in some ways the conversation about race and racialization in America and enslavement and slavery has been much more open and is much more difficult to avoid. Nevertheless, there is also a European conversation and set of theories, actually. We mentioned Gloria Wecker, we have Nancy here, we have Philomena Essed. And so I think this is a thing where, yes, we want to draw on the good work that is being done and also think in the European context about what is here, what is unique to here, and what are the problems that are here that we can address. And so, yes, both learn from American studies, but also realize that this is rooted in European soil as well, that we have excellent theorists here and that we can speak to Europe in ways that won't necessarily open us up to critiques of just applying American stuff to a European context, and so won't alienate people. I've been struggling with that a little bit myself.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think, we shouldn't forget that, I guess, one of the biggest export products of Europe has been, racism, and it's been American, scholars who've given that back to us again, because we had also then externalized it, and I think we're kind of done with, we're not done. We're always going to be friends in that sense, but I think it's hugely important to continue working from a more European standpoint on these matters, but also acknowledge that there has been knowledge production done on this in Europe itself. Just, Americans are just better marketeers than we are, for sure. I mean, really. This is also why, everyone thinks that slavery has to do only with transatlantic slave trade, because that's what the Americans always tell us. But in the Dutch case, actually Indian Ocean slavery, was done in bigger numbers in terms of the Dutch. So we should really take that into account, which also complexifies, the question of race in and of itself, of course. And write a little bit about that in our book, and we could have done a whole book on that, and we should, maybe. We find someone to find us that. But so you're right, but at the same time, we should really, do our own work much more. I don't know if that answers.
No, definitely. So rather a sort of openness towards the conversation rather than the actual conversation. We should start our own conversation and build from our own knowledge.
Yeah, and acknowledge that there has been work done in European countries on this, Nobody knows this, but Gloria Wecker, Michael Bookman, and I wrote a book on, the black migrant refugee women's movement in the Netherlands that had been around in the 80s. Does anyone know that?
Yes.
Yeah, well, there's two people in the room, which is great. But you see my point here, right?
So actually, the hour has run away from us. So I think we'll just take 2 more questions. We had one question that we actually directed towards Matthias earlier, and we talked, and everyone kind of mentioned about plausible deniability and not being able to see slavery on the shores of Europe or the crown colonies' lands. So we asked if there's a difference between decolonizing from the perspective of the colonizer versus the colonized, because the former colonies are doing all this work trying to dismantle the structures that put them in the position that they were trying to undo their history. But how can we decolonize the Netherlands itself? Do you have any ideas to how we can do that? Or and more explicitly mention to the viewers?
We end with a question as big as the one we started with. So how can we decolonize? It's such a big question because it involves basically everything we were just talking about. So I'm a bit sort of finding the hard one to answer in just one sentence, but. Maybe sort of one of the other questions on your list is actually good actually, because if you ask me how to decolonize, I'm looking forward. And if you ask me how to do reparations, suddenly it becomes very concrete, even though in the end it might.
I think that's a good lesson to take away from this. Actually,
sorry.
It's a good lesson to take away from this. Actually, it's more specific questions, and then we can have more answers. Leading towards the bigger question.
Perhaps, but that's the thing. It's sort of if you ask how to decolonize, you're sort of asking how to reach some final state where everything is solved, and that's the connotation that question easily has. Well, it's a constant thing, and maybe these concrete things are things that you more easily pile up. So do research, acknowledge how the past looked like, try to have in textbooks. Have these conversations here at the university and keep on doing all those things. And I think it's a good thing if you continue to do those things and if you keep asking those questions. It's a good question. I don't know why how to decolonize has this sort of finality connotation for me while other questions don't. I'm not sure how this is with you guys, or do you have already answered?
It's your turn.
Well, so okay, then this is my answer. We can decolonize by first perhaps assuming that it's never gonna happen in full, and then maybe along in the process we arrive at slightly better places than we are at now. Yeah? No?
Yes. And then, I don't know if anyone else will have anything to... Yes, please, borrow my mic.
Well, let me start by saying what a great gathering and what an eye-opener to myself, and especially seeing so many people. Just acknowledging the fact that things need to be changed. With that said and out of the way, my question to all three of you academics, I mean, I consider myself the dumbest person in the room here, that's why I'm asking the question. Wouldn't it be safe to assume that racism does not go away, but just hides? And racism exists in all walks of life and all levels of society, from politics to everyone else. And wouldn't it be safe to say that definitely racism is something which we all might be guilty of in some way, just the moment we get caught by the devil and not paying attention to somebody else's needs? Wouldn't it be safe just to say, it is there, we have to deal with it? And perhaps this is something which we never can deny in the society. I wonder what your thoughts are on that one.
So I'll take the first stab. I mean, there's been a lot of great work written on racism, and I feel a little unqualified to sort of speak to that. And of course, all the names of the books are fleeing me at the moment. But I do think one of the really important things to acknowledge is there's always prejudice, right? And groups of people are always prejudiced against each other. But the word racism speaks historically to a specific process whereby some groups of people were racialized. And in this instance, today we were speaking about people specifically racialized as non-white and black. And that process, which began to occur in the Enlightenment, had very, very material consequences, socio and economic consequences. And so, yeah, of course, at the one level you can say, well, everybody's prejudiced or there's a lot of discrimination, but I do think it's sometimes very important to have some form of historical specificity about what racism is and against who it is enacted. And so one of the historical answers, although this is something I'm still trying to work out, and you will get many different answers from many different communities. And I talk to many different communities about this, and there are different answers. But historically, I think when you see the construction of people as biologically, essentially, unalterably other by virtue of their skin color, and a whole host of qualities is attached to that, and then oppression is, and then people oppress that group of people based on that set of characteristics and racialization, which is a social construct, but has very real lived consequences. That, to me, is racism, and I think I am going to refer to many of our American colleagues, but also in the Dutch context. Philomena Essed and Goriel Becker have spoken to this, and actually Wayne Modest at the Wereld Museum has spoken about, he can theorize all he likes about universalism and discrimination, and he walks out on the street and sometimes the police will look at him a different way because of the way he's racialized. So that's a little bit of a rambling answer, except to say that I think racism does sometimes need a little more specificity, and in this context tonight we've been speaking a little bit about it as a form of oppression that is enacted upon people who are racialized black with socioeconomic and lived experiences, even though race itself is a construct. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Maybe the others can take a better stab at it.
I think it's a great answer.
This as well. So actually, according to the schedule, we have come to the end of this wonderful panel discussion. I also wish we had more time, but I'd like to extend my thanks to the speakers once again for coming and enlightening us with all your work and your research. Also to everyone else who helped our network finally create our second event for Diversity Month. It's a very big step for us, and we're very happy that you all can join us tonight. And thank you so much. You're welcome to join the Borrel at the end. And yes, thank you. This is the end.